Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hello Velocity podcast, where we help corporate women level up without burning out. I'm your host, Brittany Canaski, leadership coach and trainer here at Hello Velocity. And today we're joined by Tessa Shahid to talk about stress and burnout as a caregiver. Tessa is a project leader, podcast host, youth mentor, and advocate for aging populations. She spent over 15 years navigating caregiving alongside major life milestones. Both of her parents have since passed, and the lessons from that season continue to shape her work. She hosts Between Now and Next, a podcast in Substack focused on caregiving, grief, and life transitions. Thank you, Tessa, for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this.
I'm so glad this idea popped in my head, honestly, while we were doing yoga together. And as much as we try to, completely zen out and be present in the moment, I'm really excited to have this conversation today. And I think what you're doing is really impactful. So thank you for being willing to share today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
First, let's talk more about what had you starting your own podcast, the Between Now and Next podcast about caregiving.
Yeah. So I started the podcast. A part of me wants to say it was like a little bit on a whim. But I had been asked for a long time at various points throughout my caregiver journey for support from friends whenever they would deal with different situations related to caregiving, even if they weren't like fully in the role. Whether that's like local resources or just how to navigate, just the overall situation. And I would, of course, help and provide, advice in any way that I could. But then I was also asked for many years throughout my journey, like, what was I going to do with all of the information, right, from that I had learned and my experiences as a caregiver. And if I'm being honest, for a long time, I said I wasn't going to do anything with it. And I think that was because I was in the thick of it, right, for so long, and it's hard to, quite frankly, consider anything else when you are a caregiver and you're fully entrenched in it. But after my dad passed, I'm not sure what happened and kind of what the moment was, but basically it seemed like a switch kind of got flipped, and it was like, you know what, like this is a lot. Like you've seen a lot, you've done a lot, you've come through a lot. There are so many people that are, in caregiver roles already. And it's very isolating and you feel alone and, you're lacking resources and things of that nature. Or there are lots of people who will one day be in that position and they don't know what to expect, and how to prepare. And so, I started brainstorming after, dealing with that, and then decided to just go ahead on and try it and see, how things would go. And I started Between Now and Next. I started like as a Substack, kind of first, and then created the podcast from there. And it's been really healing, I would say, so far for myself, which was unexpected.
Wow, that's great to hear that it's kind of become full circle. It went from something that you're in the thick of it, you're like, I can't really expand on it, or I can't maybe
Hmm.
help other people in the moment when you're still in it and you're still processing and you're still grieving and all the things. And now it's become such a resource for other people, but also healing for yourself. That's amazing that it's become
Yeah.
that full circle for you too. Like, again, it's just so powerful, and to provide such a safe space for other people too. Like you said, it can be such a lonely process, and it's very different from just Googling something and trying to find an answer. People are probably
It
looking
is.
for community, for
Yeah.
people, for
Yeah.
someone to talk to or hear from firsthand experiences, and not just, I'm going to read what an AI summary says I should do in such a delicate and personal,
Hmm.
difficult situation. That's
That
powerful.
is so true. Yeah. And it's very different from Googling too, because oftentimes you don't have the language for what you're doing or what you're thinking or what you're feeling even before you become a caregiver. And so yeah.
That definitely makes sense. So, speaking of language, how do you define caregiving, and how does someone know that they're a caregiver?
That is a very good question. So I think for me, I think generally speaking, as somebody that is either providing direct care for someone that is unable to take care of themselves, or either you are ahead of that part of the journey and it's weighing on you, right? So like you're starting to have the thoughts around it, or either you're supporting someone emotionally, right? Maybe it's a little bit of a lighter lift, so to speak. But I think, and then I think also I would add that it's not just, I think someone, whether you're providing direct care or you are in a position where you've got like the emotional weight of it, if you will, or the stress, or you're starting to like noodle on those things, what does that look like? It's not just doing it for like an aging parent, which I feel like is what you hear about probably more than anything, right? Aging parents, grandparents, etc. But it's also people who may have a special needs child, right? Or somebody that is, caring for a friend, right? Or if you're kind of stepping in, let's say somebody has a surgery and they're like, oh, do you mind taking me to the appointment? Or can you set up a meal train, right? Those are also some examples as well. Like you don't have to be fully in the trenches to be considered a caregiver.
Yeah, that's such a great distinction because my head always had historically gone to that place too of, okay, your elderly parent moved in with you. That is, the
Mm-hmm.
probably most talked about situation, but it's
Yeah,
interesting to think about it. It could be temporary, it could be someone recovering from surgery, a day, a week, multiple weeks, months, years, it could be this whole variety of situations, timelines, but then also it's not always someone you're related to. It's not someone maybe you're
very
close,
true.
but it can still
Yeah,
have
yeah.
that emotional toll on you. Like you said, it's kind of that two pieces to it. It sounds like both the
Mm-hmm.
maybe physical time commitment, but then also the emotional commitment or almost burden, it sounds like too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I try not to think of it. I would say another reason I try not to think of it as it's just someone being like in the trenches and being a full-time caregiver, if you will, is because there are, I don't know, oftentimes it will dismiss the other unique circumstances that people find themselves in. And I will give an example. Like I have come across people where a sibling or another loved one or family member, if you will, is the one that lives close by. And they're the one that is taking on kind of the brunt of the role, if you will, for lack of a better term, but they live hours away or states away. And so even though they're not in it day to day, which definitely is a heavier lift, it doesn't mean they're not feeling something, right? In
Mhm.
even though like their role looks a little bit different, so yeah, so that's also why I think that there's a few different ways to look at it, and everybody's situation is really unique, and it's not, being a caregiver is not like a one box fits all either.
Mhm. Definitely. And similarly, I think an interesting point to call out too is that, well, we just had a new mom on the podcast last week, which is another
Hmm.
kind of inspiration for having you on here too, is thinking about
Yeah.
caregiving from kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum, but then it, like,
Uh-huh.
as you explain caregiving at a simple level, it sounds very similar, right? You're caring for someone else, they're depending on you,
Hmm.
and there is an emotional toll on both. But how do you see
Yeah.
this type of caregiving we're talking about today different from a traditional parent-child relationship?
Oh man. It's so good that you mentioned that, because I often over the years of caring for my parents, I have compared it to being a parent. So what I want to start off by saying is I do not have children. So I will not pretend to know what it's like to, have a child and be there, at their beck and call, so to speak, right through that like newborn stage when you're really exhausted and, just going through those different phases of raising a child. However, I have a lot of experience with kids and have nieces and all of that. And I would say that caring for an aging parent is very similar, but the sad part about it and what makes us different is that they're going backwards. So with your child, you're raising them, you're teaching them, you're instilling things in them, right? And with your parents specifically, right, from an aging standpoint, they're reverting, and depending on their health issues, especially for people who have like dementia, they're losing everything, and by the time they get to the end, so to speak, they are, just kind of a shell of themselves. So I think that being a caregiver, it is of someone that is aging, it can be very similar in that the exhaustion is there, the stress is there, and you're dealing with different, you have different phases and everything of that experience, but it's the opposite of what you have for a child. The other thing that I would add that makes it a little bit different, and challenging, quite frankly, is that when you're taking care of an adult, they've lived a life, right? They have their values and their beliefs and their traumatic experiences and their good times and their bad times and all of these different things, their personality traits, right? That make them who they are. And that complicates the caregiving experience because all of that is, can impact what that looks like on a day to day.
Yeah, that's a great point to call out. And I'm even thinking about that for not only the aging caregiving situations, but I'm sure someone recovering from a surgery or more of like a short-term
Yeah.
caregiving responsibility. I'm sure that still is a factor there of sometimes as adults we can be stubborn or we like things a certain way or
Yes.
this is where my whatever my blankets go or my pillows, like whatever it is,
Very true.
and then if someone's trying to help you, it can be more difficult or,
Yeah.
maybe similarly difficult as a child who is still learning and doesn't know some of that. So it's an interesting
Exactly. Yeah.
contrast. And I see too the aging population side of the caregiving. Yeah, it sounds obviously difficult emotionally in a different way of like you don't have the milestones that, when you're caregiving to your own child, I imagine you have those milestones to look forward to of their development, their learning, and it's things
Yeah.
that are, in theory, hopefully things are getting easier as you go along, where I imagine and have seen in the aging population caregiving, it's things, there's probably milestones still, yes, but they're not uplifting, they're not exciting,
Right. Yeah.
they're not
Yeah. They're
positive for
not
the most,
good ones necessarily. Yeah.
yeah, so
Depending
it's
on the circumstances, right? I mean,
yes.
after, a good one, I suppose, could be like my both of my parents had strokes at some point, throughout their life. But like for a stroke patient or somebody that has any replacement surgery, quite frankly, if the stroke isn't fatal and they're able to go into rehabilitation, if they, experience any sort of paralysis, one of the good milestones could be them taking their first steps again, right? Learning how to walk again. And for somebody that's had a knee replacement surgery, which sometimes can be should be a routine surgery. It can be a routine surgery for somebody that is very healthy and maybe a bit younger. But whereas if they would go to rehab, for like a week, and again they're learning certain things. So depending on the circumstances, there can be good milestones like that, right? That you have to look forward to. But then in other circumstances, there are some that are the opposite, right? So like I mentioned for dementia patients, like I remember when my dad was diagnosed, and within a few years of it he did pass, but towards the end he got to a point where he couldn't swallow anymore. His diet and stuff had to be changed, had to be adjusted. And at some point, yeah, like he wasn't able to swallow food, certain systems within the body like stopped working, right? It's that going backwards. So those type of milestones, so to speak, or symptoms or things that you're looking out for, can be really challenging, and painful sometimes, right? To watch somebody go through that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So you've touched on it a bit already, but do you mind sharing more about your own experience as a caregiver? And I know this is a big part of your podcast
Yeah.
and part of your, I mean, obviously a huge part of your story and who you are as well.
Yeah, no, it's a huge part of my story. Yeah. No, I don't mind at all. So I think the gist of it is that both of my parents were sick. So at some point I was a primary caregiver for both of them. And their journeys looked very different health-wise. And I won't go into too much detail, but kind of what started my father's is that he had a massive stroke when I was 11 years old that paralyzed him on his left side. And so that was kind of, I call it like the big thing, right? The life-changing, life-altering thing that happened with him. And even though that did happen and it was incredibly hard and very, very challenging, at some point after all of that, he was able to, make adjustments so that he could live comfortably, so to speak, with that, right? With this newfound disability, if you will. And he, for the most part, did really well, but strokes was his Achilles heel, if we want to call it that. But the thing that, impacted him from like a health standpoint. And then at some point he was diagnosed with dementia. And then for my mother, it was a little bit more tumultuous. And she had a much harder journey, I would say. And it was a lot heavier and just a lot more involved. So she dealt with a lot of different things over the years. But what kind of started things going downhill for her health wise, that she had a knee replacement surgery. Unfortunately, that again, for someone healthier, maybe younger, would, typically could be a routine surgery. But in her case, it wasn't. And she had a stroke on the operating table when they, did that surgery. And from then on, for many reasons, without going into those details, life was never really the same for her after that. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's interesting too. I know part of how you talk about it too is just how young you were going through this. So I imagine that is a huge part, again, a huge part of your story.
Yeah.
How you become who you are today. And I'm sure that was a lot of stress and overwhelm on you and for anyone at any age also. So our theme for this season, as you know, is stress and burnout. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that. What are some of those factors that can cause burnout in caregivers, and maybe what can they do to navigate it or ideally prevent it if possible? And I know, again, this is part of the work that you're putting out there too, and helping and providing resources for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So caregivers can burn out for so many different reasons. Honestly, I mean, a lot of what leads to burnout, I think, here's what I'll say. I think even if you have the most ideal circumstances as a caregiver, you are still at risk for burning out, right? And what I mean by ideal, and again, everyone's situation looks different, but in the most ideal scenario, right, it's like you're not doing it by yourself. You have a village around you. And whether it's, let's say it's like aging parent, if it's aging parents, it's like it's yourself, and maybe you have a few siblings, right? Or you have other family members that are around, that can carry the load, and where each of you have a bit of a different role, if you will, in that person's care. Depending on how serious it is, maybe as a part of that community, you also have medical staff, right? So whether that's, home health care, but professionals who are also there to support you outside of their doctors, right? And you have some semblance of routine and systems around like this experience, right? And even with that, you're still going to face challenges, and it's still going to be hard, but it does look a lot different when you have that type of setup, so to speak. And again, you're still at risk for burnout. Whereas there are people more often than not that are doing it alone. And so whether that is because they don't have family, or they do have family, and they don't have, the best of relationships, or maybe that, they have family, but their family is not nearby. Right. Or maybe, there's so many different kind of views of it, if you will. But I think either way, you're at risk for burnout. And oftentimes I feel like one of the ways that it starts is that you're always on mentally as a caregiver. You cannot turn off, right? Whether it's the worry, the anticipation, you're constantly thinking and constantly trying to figure out the next step, and medications, and what to do, and how to prevent emergencies, or dealing with the emergencies. So I think always being on is a big one. Even when you have a break, even if you can, get someone to step in, for you and help you. I think the lack of control and clear boundaries is another one. Again, depending on your loved one, or the person that you're caring for, depending on their situation, um, things can change very rapidly. You can go from maybe things being fairly even keel to them having a crisis, right? And that just upends everything. Or you can be in the situation where maybe it is just constant crisis after crisis, right? Because everyone's, again, situation looks differently. And from a lack of control standpoint, you are reactive. You're not in a position where you can be proactive and you can be strategic, if you will, or intentional. It's really, really, really hard. So that reactivity causes a lot of stress, right? And then in terms of the boundaries aspect of it, that could be from a work standpoint, life standpoint in general, boundaries with the person you're caring for. It can be boundaries with family, right? So that can hit every single area of your life. But I think the biggest thing with that is like everything feels urgent. Everything feels like, an emergency oftentimes. And then there's the emotional complexity of being a caregiver. Um, the guilt and sometimes resentment, quite frankly, the grief, that you can deal with even while the person is, still living. The emotional weight of being a caregiver is astronomical. And it's deafening and it's isolating and it's exhausting, beyond words. So there's that aspect of it. I think the other thing that causes burnout is the lack of support systems. So as I mentioned earlier, everyone's situation is very unique. And even when you do have the most ideal, whatever that could be for you and for your loved one, there are still challenges within our systems in America where there's just a lack of support, a lack of resources, whether that's community based, whether it's financial. And it does make things much harder than they really should be. And then I think the other is you lose yourself. You can lose yourself in it, being a caregiver. And that aids in burnout as well. And when you're a professional, right? When you work, a 9 to 5, or even if, you're an entrepreneur, but when you're working, and you are, supporting yourself and, supporting your family, and then also having to be a caregiver, whether it blindsides you or it's something that you were a little bit prepared for or knew that was coming, it is really, really, really hard. And I think a lot of it's like the responsibility and the weight of both don't shift. It's like there are still expectations there. You still have to clock in every day and do your work and attend meetings and do a full, 8 hours, 9 hours. And if you're, an executive, it can be a whole lot more than that. And so burnout rarely comes from one thing, I would say, being a caregiver. It's a multitude. Yeah.
That definitely makes sense. And similar to what we talked about last week in the podcast about being a parent and having a full-time job, it's literally having two full-time jobs.
Oh,
And
yeah,
then,
absolutely.
yeah, and this sounds very similar, of course, and again, depending on the situation, but it's likely you have two full-time jobs, one being a caregiver, one being your actual work that is paying you.
Yeah.
But then there's this added layer that you mentioned of the emotional complexity of the grief, potential resentment, just the guilt. There's so many more, I'm sure, emotions that are being piled on there that even just thinking about the emotional complexity could probably weigh on someone like a full-time job. It's so taxing, and I think people forget how much emotions can really impact us physically and with our energy and how we're showing up. So it's I imagine a lot of times people are just trying to continue on as if everything's the same and I'm still showing up for my job and I'm still showing up for this other person. And I'm sure people are just running on negative energy. And, I was
running on fumes.
Yeah, right.
To say the least.
I talk about it a lot as either the battery metaphor of, you need to charge your own battery and have energy, or the filling your own cup. But I'm sure in this situation, a lot of times people are at negative. It's not even empty. It's depleted to the point of any little thing you do to try to then regain your own energy or take care of yourself, I'm sure you're hardly even getting back to zero. So it's, I imagine, and again, depending on the length of time and the time commitment, the physical commitment in the work situation, I imagine could be a long time for people to get back to themselves. Like you're saying, you might lose yourself. That totally makes sense of you are just giving physically, emotionally, and that's so draining. And we talked about obviously burnout and stress this whole season. and people can get burnt out just from their day job. So again, this is two jobs essentially, plus the emotional complexity. Like, I imagine burnout could happen pretty quickly, or more quickly than other situations where it's more of a work related situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you think about it like burnout in the workplace, which yes, I often think. So I used to do like a lot of strategic planning and stuff, as you're aware. And something that I would often say to people, like when they're planning out their goals and identifying, what they want to accomplish, whether that was from a business standpoint or personally, they needed to consider all of the hats that they wear, right? And so if we only think about it, if we just start with like it just being a professional, right? And how that alone you can experience burnout with, right? Depending on like your workload, the role that you're in, what level you're in the organization, the culture of the organization, right? The phase of business or season of business, quite frankly, that the company is in. Then you have to think about all of the hats that you wear. And so for somebody, let's say it's somebody who's like, you're a professional, you are married, you are a parent, you are a caregiver, and let's say you're also like involved in your community, right? On boards or committees or whatever. Those are all different hats and all different roles, and all of them have different responsibilities and different levels of stress that come with them, right? So yeah, like I don't know, I feel like we all carry a lot, right? Without adding on being a caregiver. And then once you do add that on, it's just you. I don't know. It's a lot, is what I will say. And then I think also to your point about being depleted and not really being able to get back to zero. At some point, you just stay in survival mode. Like that is what I will say. At some point, it goes from burnout to being in survival mode. And sometimes, as a caregiver, I mean, are there different things that you can do to try to prevent it? Absolutely, right? Or at least, to manage it, sure. But depending on your circumstances, it may not help. It may not help. And then you may find yourself either in a situation where you have to make some tough decisions around the caregiver role, right? Or even the professional role, quite frankly. Or either you find yourself in a position where you just have to deal with it, right? And then you just accept the fact that like I'm in survival mode. If you're at that state where you feel like, you can recognize those signs and stuff, but you're in survival mode, you'll do the little things that you can to just keep yourself going until you can't anymore. And I say that because that was me. I spent, I feel like majority of my years as a caregiver in survival mode, and I didn't know it for a very, very long time. I didn't realize it for a long time, and then I didn't realize like how bad it was and just how much it took a toll on me physically, emotionally, my health, like all of it. And it probably wasn't, and honestly, until my parents passed, maybe, or close to their passing, I would say. Maybe the last few years of like being an active caregiver, as I say. But yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense that it's almost the past burnout stage of just survival mode of I'm just doing the bare bones to take care of myself, to
Yep.
get
That's
through
right.
the situation. And I'm sure a lot of it too, people are probably so emotionally exhausted that you kind of have to like shut down a bit emotionally, or else,
Yep.
it's unsustainable also to just be, crying and grieving every single day for months and months or years and years, so it's like at some point you do have to almost shut it off, it sounds like. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And
to
sometimes you
really,
do it without knowing. Like it's not even an intentional decision, right? It just ends
oh
up
yeah,
being a place where you land. Yeah.
yeah, and like you said, you're making these decisions and you have to be continuing to move forward. And especially again, if you are a working professional on top of a caregiver, on top of a parent, again, all these roles. So it sounds like you've mentioned boundaries can be really helpful in these different situations.
Yeah.
I imagine too, having different people to support you along the way, or different resources to support you, or even just learning where you need to say no, or where are those lines for you of, okay, maybe I need to step back on some of my community involvement for this season or for however long, so that I can have some time left for myself, or because I know I'm going to be emotionally taxed during the season. I know I'm going to be stretching my time, my capacity. And yeah, I think that could be part of it too, is just recognizing where you're at and knowing that something's probably going to have to give and things are going to have to change. And where can you say no to things? Where can you drop some things? Where can you ask for support? Where can you seek out other resources. And yeah, what about when it comes to someone who is a caregiver and a professional? Is there anything that you've seen that companies have been doing to support people, or anything that an individual can maybe, like, what kind of support they could ask for in this type of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's been a few things. So I think one, I would say like tapping into resources via like your health insurance, everything that's offered, to maybe chat with a therapist. So finding a therapist or a counselor like that can be very helpful. And tangible in a way that you're not holding in all of those emotions, right, to yourself and not taking the time to process them. And recognizing that caregivers have very little time, especially if you are someone's like primary caregiver and you're providing like all of their care, that definitely looks a little bit different. But it's still a resource that I, recommend to people. So I would say that's one. I would check and see, depending on the size of your organization, if they have like an employee resource group that would be a good fit, even if it's not directly for caregivers, right? But I would look into that as well. So those would be two things. And then depending on the relationship, and this is something that I'm really passionate about and plan on covering on my own podcast at some point, but just like how organizations can better support caregivers, at work. I think some of that, the other thing in terms of a resource, is having a conversation, if you're comfortable and if you have a really good relationship with them, with your boss, with your manager, and letting them know like what is on your plate and the season that you're in. And you don't have to divulge all of the details, right? But maybe giving them a heads up so that they know what to expect. I think another thing that you could potentially do is take like FMLA so that you can take that break. That could be an option, right? So there are a few from a work standpoint, from an employer standpoint. I will be honest, I don't think that organizations are supporting caregivers, enough, within the workplace. I think there are some companies out there who are doing a really, really good job of it. But that's not just a gap within the workforce. It's also just a gap in general, right? That we have. So yeah, but those would be a few from a workforce standpoint. And then I think it's just a matter of covering that area and then stepping outside of work and determining, okay, what resources exist locally and within the community that maybe I haven't tapped into yet, maybe that I'm not aware of yet, and seeing how those can be put in place to better support you.
Yeah, I love all of these. Thank you for sharing all these specific examples to
Yes.
get people started and thinking about it differently. And I will just double down on the idea of having a conversation with your manager. That's definitely something I'm encouraging a lot when it comes to burnout, is that it needs to be a conversation with them. And of course, hopefully to prevent it as much as possible, prevent burnout as much as possible. But yeah, we need to have these two-way conversations with our managers so they know where we're at, what's on our plate, where we're coming from, and they're not jumping to conclusions. They're not making assumptions on their side. They're not, just thinking they know what's going on, or thinking you're just now disengaged or becoming a poor performer or something like that. So we want to be proactive as much as we can around those conversations.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
Yeah, and I know I feel like we're just kind of hitting the surface of this topic, and there's so much more, and there's so much more complexity to it, but I appreciate you sharing this today. And how can listeners get in touch with you or follow along to learn more about caregiving?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn if they would like. But subscribe to the podcast between now and next. And you can subscribe directly to the podcasting platforms like Apple and Spotify, or either just follow me on LinkedIn and subscribe there. I mean, not LinkedIn, Substack.
All right, sounds good. I will put those links in our show notes so people can find you even more easily. And yes, thank you again, Tessa, for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing so openly and giving all of these resources and tips for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you to our listeners for joining today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like or subscribe on the podcast platform you're listening on. It really helps new people find the podcast, and in turn, the support that they're looking for as well. That's it for today. We'll see you in the next episode.